As I was saying, a number of Kennedy's top military advisors were very upset that he had not invaded Cuba. Also upset was Fidel Castro. Castro learned about Khrushchev's deal with Kennedy over the radio. Khrushchev had not even notified him that he'd cut this deal to pull all the missiles out of Cuba. And Castro reportedly was irate, and undoubtedly this hurt Cuban-Soviet relations. The affair also it reflected fairly well on Kennedy, certainly in terms of popular opinion in the U.S. It seems to have helped him. But Khrushchev, it hurt Khrushchev, and it made him look bad, even worse than he had looked in the Soviet Union. And the next year he was removed from leadership by the senior communist leadership in the Soviet Union and replaced with Leonid Brezhnev. How to judge Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis? How should we view it with the perspective of history? Many have given Kennedy high marks for his handling, for his poise, his prudence, and his toughness, for his coolness under pressure, and for his ability to achieve his fundamental goals without resort to the use of force, which might well have led to the Third World War, which would have, of course, been a nuclear war. And just recall again that most of his advisors at one time or another had called for airstrikes, which could well have led to war, nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And indeed, Kennedy does merit praise for all of this. He seems to have handled the crisis quite well, resisting calls to escalate it while still pursuing the worthy goal that the Soviets pull their missiles out of Cuba, missiles that were directly threatening the United States. And yet, it is to be remembered that Kennedy had the option that he did not choose to use of trying to negotiate all of this quietly with the Soviets without making it into a public, high-stakes game. Kennedy didn't try that option. He did not try initially to do a back-channel negotiation of the kind that one can easily imagine Eisenhower doing with Khrushchev. He didn't even try that route. And as a result, by making all of this public on the 22nd, he essentially turned the standoff into a very, very high-stakes, high-noon sort of game of brinksmanship in which thermonuclear war could have been the result. So it's hard to give him high marks for not having at least tried private back-channel negotiation initially. But once he'd made that decision, that fateful decision, not even to try back-channel negotiation, one really can't fault the way he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as I said before, certainly his public popularity in the U.S. did not suffer from his handling of the crisis. Let's talk a little bit about Vietnam. Vietnam would become, of course, a much bigger issue under the presidency of Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, and his successor, Richard Nixon. Vietnam was not really a big deal. Most Americans weren't terribly concerned with, or didn't necessarily even know much about what was going on in Vietnam during the Kennedy presidency. And for Kennedy himself, it was not a high priority, at least not until 1963, when it became apparent to him that things were not going well for the South, the forces of South Vietnam. Nonetheless, Vietnam was an important piece of the global Cold War to Kennedy. He was a believer in the domino theory. He believed that he was also a believer that the Soviets directed communist insurrection around the world. In this case, he wasn't terribly accurate when it came to Ho Chi Minh, who was pretty self-directed in North Vietnam. But Kennedy did see Vietnam as important, and he did see it as a place where the Soviets were trying to test Western resolve. And he was determined not to let the domino of Vietnam fall and quite possibly lead to the knocking over of other dominoes in Asia. Kennedy ramped up the number of American advisors, Green Berets and other American military personnel who were working with the South Vietnamese forces. He ramped up those numbers from 1,000 when he became president to 16,732 by the time he was assassinated. A great counterfactual is, what would Kennedy have done had he lived? And of course, we'll never know. As with any counterfactual, there is no really good answer, but it's interesting to contemplate those questions sometimes. Kennedy, of course, was an ardent Cold Warrior. He certainly didn't want to lose Vietnam, as Truman had been widely seen as having lost China, and he certainly didn't want to let down his allies in Diem and his other allies in South Vietnam. However, he had been chastened by the Bay of Pigs fiasco, so it's unlikely that he would have certainly instantly given in to requests by military advisors for a massive escalation of forces in order to win the war. Having gone through the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was skeptical of the advice of the top CIA and military officials. So certainly he would have kept his own counsel, probably consulted a lot with his brother, Bobby Kennedy, before deciding what to do. He was not, certainly following the Bay of Pigs, he was not rash about the use of military force. And so to me, it's doubtful that he would have escalated in the manner and to the extent that Lyndon Johnson did in early 1965. But of course, this is one of those questions that has no real answer. We'll never know what Kennedy would have done had he lived and been reelected as president in 1964. Turning to Kennedy's domestic agenda and accomplishments. Kennedy raised high hopes when he was elected. He was young. He was charismatic. Patterson calls him the most able politician of his generation. He was extremely telegenic, and he raised the hopes particularly of liberals and progressives who really hadn't had a whole lot to cheer about since the 1930s when the New Deal had been in high gear. Poverty, education, the decline of cities, and most particularly civil rights were all areas that liberals cared a lot about, and they wanted to see action from Kennedy. And Kennedy promised action. He promised an aggressive, deeply involved, deeply engaged presidency. He ended up, however, in his nearly 3 years in office, not really accomplishing a whole lot on the domestic front. Why was that? Well, for the first reason, foreign policy was really Kennedy's passion, and it's where he felt that he could do the most good, probably. He had certainly had a lot more free rein when it came to foreign policy than he did domestic policy. As president, he could, as the commander-in-chief, he could send troops in to Laos, for instance. He didn't have that kind of latitude in terms of domestic policy. As the president at the height of the Cold War, foreign policy and military policy just naturally demanded a lot of his attention and drew it away from domestic policy. Second, Kennedy faced the same challenging Congress that American liberal presidents had faced since 1937, when a coalition of Democrats and Republicans had defeated President Roosevelt's attempt to pack the U.S. Supreme Court. Since that time, really very little in the way of major domestic legislation, reform legislation, had been passed. What happened was Republicans would often team up with conservative Southern Democrats to defeat progressive domestic legislation. Most particularly, the Southern Democrats really went against any kind of civil rights legislation. But they often found support in their opposition to civil rights and other progressive legislation from the Republican Party. And this was essentially an unassailable coalition. And Kennedy found that to be the case as well. It would take a master legislator, Lyndon Johnson, who was arguably the most powerful and influential Senate Majority Leader of all time, to overcome this coalition in the Congress, this essentially conservative coalition. Kennedy made great speeches on domestic affairs. He was a brilliant speaker. And he advanced major legislation that he favored, such as tax cut legislation and a civil rights bill, a major civil rights bill following the Birmingham Civil Rights Marches of 1963. But nothing major got passed while he was president. Kennedy was bedeviled particularly by the young civil rights marchers. While supportive of their position, he essentially was dragged along by them, by the Freedom Riders, who were trying to desegregate public accommodations in the Deep South, by those who were doing nonviolent lunch counter sit-ins, by those who were advocating for voting rights for poor blacks in Mississippi and other states, and by Martin Luther King Jr.'s campaigns for civil rights in Birmingham, Alabama, and elsewhere. JFK essentially kept telling the civil rights movement, hey, I'm with you, but hold on. Don't provoke Southern anger. Don't provoke white Southern resistance. Hang on, hold on, I'll do something for you. But he kept failing to deliver. And he was essentially out of step with the tenor of the times and out of step with the tenor of the young civil rights leaders who wanted action now, who felt they had waited long enough. That waiting, 100 years since the end of the Civil War was enough waiting for them. Kennedy also continually tried to work with the civil rights community and also the white Southern leaders to ensure the safety of civil rights leaders in the Deep South. And he had mixed results with this. Sometimes he was able to ensure the safety of the civil rights leaders, and other times he was not. And he, at least until 1963, when he supported a major civil rights bill, Kennedy really did not stick his neck out much on civil rights, and was something of a disappointment to Martin Luther King Jr. and others in the civil rights community. And that's pretty much it for today. Thanks, everybody.